Welcome to Health Reform 2.0, the only place on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Here we take you on a journey of our current quagmire, tell you where it came from and why the government can't fix it. Along the way, we'll tell you some history, bust a few big myths, tell you a few stories, and give you an idea how we can work together and get the healthcare system we want. Let's get started. In this episode, we will be discussing how the healthcare system in America is hostile. This episode specifically is going to be talking about sexual harassment in the healthcare environment. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Health Reform 2.0. Again, it's Tom Locher and Tim Henning, and we're here to try to help you find a better way to deal with America's healthcare system. We're going to focus today on this idea of a hostile and dangerous healthcare environment. And we're going to talk about some things that don't get talked about much in healthcare. Roughly 10% of all professions report some kind of abusive behaviors. The number is higher, believe it or not, in healthcare. About 30%. About 30%.
It's got to be worse than that.
So, the Me Too movement wanted to double down on abuse and sexual harassment. We've got the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia going through the sexual harassment thing at this point. We had the Kavanaugh hearing, and we've had the guy from Harvey Weinstein, and all these things. So we've gone after, rightly so in many cases, people that have developed abusive behavior and actually are abusive and using their power to abuse other people or get them to do things that they don't want to do. And it is an industry, an issue. It is an issue, and it is a problem. But it's not being talked about in healthcare. And healthcare is a place where all the rest of the abuses you see out there pale in comparison to what's going on in the medical industry today on a daily basis. So, Tim, you've run into this on a number of occasions, and you've been out there in the part of the industry that is very focused and has this happening on a daily basis. So can you give me some examples of what's going on?
I could talk about it for hours, but I'll try to keep it brief. It's pretty disgusting, ladies and gentlemen, and this industry has been full of this kind of bad behavior ever since I've known it. It's a perfect environment because you got high stress positions with physicians and nurses. You've got a lot of interaction going on between men and women, men and men, women and women. You're dealing with a group of people that are at this level within the institution and at another level within this institution. Now, unfortunately, the stigma of a physician has changed, and he or she's not getting away with stuff they used to
getting away with anymore.
But they still
people
are
talking.
They still are.
Right.
So I'm going to give you a few examples, and what I'm about to tell you, you probably are going to say, really? It's all true, ladies and gentlemen, because I've seen it and I've experienced it. One, it's sexual favors expected from implant and other industry sales reps. It's much more relevant and prevalent in orthopedics, other type of spine implants where you have the sales rep there with the physician. And in 99% of the cases, if you're putting in a hip, putting in a knee, doing kyphoplasty, these sales rep will be in that procedure. They can't do the procedure. They can't technically cross into the sterile field. Believe me, I've seen it happen because they had to come bail out the doctor. Why are they there? Well, they're there for two reasons. One, they're very valuable to the physician because when things go south, you better know which kits to pull off, which ones to open. You got to be thinking ahead based upon what you see is going on in that procedure. And a lot of these doctors make mistakes, and they don't do them that often, and the rep is basically telling them what to do. Right? The second piece is the doctor needs somebody's throat to choke if things go wrong. And that's what happens. And what happens in most of these cases, the physician has their pet reps. Now, why is that an issue? Well, their preferences are based sometimes not on what's the best implant or device. They're based on the relationship with that rep. It goes from what I mentioned before to going on vacation with the doctors, which happens all the time in orthopedics, partying together. Had a rep that was actually taking the doctor's kids to school every morning and picking them up at night, believe it or not. It has to do with some things that are against the Sunshine Act that occur on a daily basis. We've talked about that in the past. But this is important for a number of reasons, and there's a lot of studies out on this based upon waste, fraud, and abuse.
Right.
The relevance of the number of implants, if you go to a surgical convention and you walk into a convention center in Las Vegas or wherever it's at, pedicle screws everywhere, all sorts of hip devices, all sorts of knees,
right, by
many companies that are very reputable. Medtronics, although they paid so many fines for bad behavior, it's ridiculous. And the list goes on. Guess what? There's all sorts, a bunch of knockoff. Some from China, some from just companies that say, well, I can go mill a knee or a hip myself, right? Now, I'm not saying they're good or bad, but the variances are broad. And you can read many, many different studies by many of the major IDNs where they're trying to narrow this down because the physician preference is driving the cost out of control.
Right.
And is it preference because it's a better product? He's going to argue, or she's going to argue it is. But many of these things are exactly the same. A pedicle screw is a pedicle screw. So when you look at this, many of the, I've seen it, I've watched it. I've watched devices that are inferior being used because the doctor, the orthopedic surgeon, or whoever it is, has a personal relationship with the rep. Right. And that drives the cost and the variance widely. Other favors, experiencing one now, are trips, dinners, personal items, and they don't get reported. Right. Quid pro quo, speaking engagements, which I understand because you need podium speeches, but some of the behavior is irresponsible. So there's many different examples of what goes on in these environments. I'll give you one more before we jump on. This actually happened to me at a very prestigious cancer center. I went to dinner with two interventional radiologists. We had a rep there that was, I'm just going to say it, she was gorgeous, right? Okay, she was very smart and very good at what she did.
And I'm sure the reason she was there was not because of her beauty, but because of the knowledge and the other things she brought to the table.
So, which brings me to my next statement. We're sitting at dinner after this jerk orders a $200 bottle of wine. One of the jerks, there's two of them.
And was that jerk paying for it, or was he expecting you to pay for it?
Guess who you think was paying for it?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And we're going through the discussion and whatnot, and he looks at me and says, we can stop right here. He says, I'll use your product as long as, whatever her name was, comes to my lab dressed in those really, really tailored scrubs with a low-cut front end. If she doesn't, I'm going to use the other product.
Well,
dinner was over as far as I was concerned.
He knew what was important in his practice.
Well, but I asked her later, I said, why do you put up with that crap? And she said, because if I don't get paid.
Yeah.
Because reps are paid on the procedures they do. No procedures, no commission. Mm-hmm. They tolerate this behavior. They go party with these people after. And the thing that really bothers me about this is most of these surgeons are middle-aged. I'm sure they're married. They probably have a family. They must have had so much unfun in college that they're just making up for this because they didn't know anything different. They didn't know what else to do. I can't figure it out.
Or they were very insecure, and now that they've got money and power, that their security is coming by the size of their bank account.
Yeah, so if you're having a knee or hip replacement, don't ask what they're using. Ask what the rep's relationship is with the physician. They won't tell you anyway, but anyway.
So ultimately, this comes back to, what does all this mean to us as patients? Well, these things to us as patients are driving costs up, as Tim just said, but they also result in other kinds of things that are problematic. And then we're going to go through and talk about some of the other problems that are happening in healthcare that are all really being driven by money or money and relationships. And then the next one we're going to talk about is patient dumping. Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit in the last show about hospitals now are turning patients away or taking patients in, doing an initial diagnosis, and when they find that the thing that's wrong with the patient is really going to require a lot of procedures that they're not getting reimbursed well for, the patient is shoved out the door in one form or another. Mm-hmm. So, Tim, we're going to put up on screen a series of 12 different instances that will come up as we're talking. But the main point to this is in all the cases, these companies, these hospitals were fined. But, most of the fines aren't very big compared to what they would have lost if they had treated the patient in the first place, because the complications with the patient were going to overwhelm their ability to get reimbursed.
And that's why they do it.
Yeah, and it's hospitals used to have ways to make extra money, and some hospitals had endowments and it more than covered the cost and things like that. But again, despite popular belief, very few hospitals today are making money. It has astounded the CFOs of hospitals who have gone to radiology conventions in the fall and ordered all this equipment with the department heads. And then they get there in February and March, whatever the end of their fiscal year is, and they have these oh crap moments because they realize we're not getting that money in the door. Right. And they've had to then cancel those orders.
Yep.
So it's patient dumping is a big problem, and you'll see a series of examples, or you're seeing a series of examples that just came up. There's a couple that I think we want to take note of, and Tim, you're familiar with them, so why don't you bring them up?
Yeah, the most noted, if you're on the West Coast, and it occurs on the East Coast too, is Kaiser Bellflower a few years ago. This got Kaiser in big trouble, but they only paid a $250,000 fine. They dumped a patient out on Skid Road, I think more than one, I'm not exactly sure. Right. It made at least the West Coast news. I'm not sure if it made. And the other big one was Garden Regional Hospital in Los Angeles, both in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. They did the exact same thing. They paid a $450,000 fine. So, $450,000 fine to a hospital, that's peanuts in most cases when it comes to cash flow, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit more about things that have been done to stop this behavior, but unfortunately, in some cases, it still occurs.
Well, one of the things that was put in place to stop this behavior was called EMTALA, violations, which is Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. And Tim, why don't you tell everybody what EMTALA was?
Yeah, so EMTALA was put in place by federal law that requires hospital emergency departments to medically screen every patient who seeks emergency care, to stabilize or transfer those with medical emergencies, regardless of health insurance status, ability to pay. This law has been an unfunded mandate since it was enacted in 1986.
Well, you and I can argue the positives and negatives about this. The economic negatives are people now use the ER instead of insurance, even after the days of Obamacare. And the reason is because they just go in and the hospital can't turn them away. Once they get into the waiting room in the ER, they have to be seen, which increases the cost for the hospital. It takes an ER doc that should be treating a gunshot wound or some heart attack or whatever, and now they're talking to a mother that's got a child that has a common cold, where there's nothing they're going to do for them other than send them home and say, see your GP. But there's that economic impact. There's also the impact of now that hospitals have to take everybody in, as we just talked about. They look at the patient as soon as possible, and if they'll tell people in the ambulance not to come. Ambulances call in and say they've got this thing coming in. Sometimes hospitals say we're full, we can't take anybody else, even though they may not be full. But that kind of patient coming in the door is going to cost them money. We can talk about what this has done to the healthcare system. It's given people the ability to not have to go get insurance or not have to suffer any burden for their medical problem because they can go get treated for free. And it isn't free, by the way. You know, hospitals get payments from CMS that reimburse some of the losses they take for patients that can't afford to pay.
Correct.
So we subsidize those people. It has nothing to do with the insurance side. It's just we still subsidize them. Yeah. Another one of the many hidden costs that we built into this. Now, we decided to do this as a culture because we felt with our heart it was a good idea to do. There are people out there today arguing it's not a good idea to do, and if we want to fix the healthcare system, if you want to force people into being responsible for their lives, their health, and their care, you repeal this law and say if you don't have insurance when you show up or the cash to pay for the treatment, then the hospital doesn't have to treat you, or we could say the hospital can't treat you. If you want to hear more about the arguments both for and against EMTALA, if you're interested in how hospitals are hostile to other hospitals and how insurance companies are hostile to everyone, or if you want to find out more about the issues with Veterans Administration hospitals, tune in to the next episode. You've been listening to Health Reform 2.0 with your hosts Tom Locher and Tim Henning. We hope you found the topics interesting, that we answered a few questions, that you laughed a bit and were entertained. Please feel free to invite your friends to join the discussion, and remember, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Send us your questions to info@hr-20.com. We hope to see you again next time.